down the street. All right.
All right.
So catching us online, offline. Hey, everybody, it's Reed Galen. Welcome to the Monday edition of Lunch with Lincoln. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Maya May. Maya,
hello.
Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So guys, today we want to take some of your questions. And I asked Maya to join me here because Maya, I think, far better represents what goes on in what I will call the real world of the United States of America, with folks getting through their days, having kids, having jobs, and as opposed to me, who spends a lot of time head down reading and doing other things. So Maya, just before we get going on the questions, what's the world look like from your end right now?
Stressed. The world is stressed. Everybody's stressed. I was actually having this conversation with my mom, and I was like, what's the pulse, right? Like, we're looking around and everybody's going about their day, like they're shopping. It's back to school time right now, but back to school looks different. I have a 13-year-old going into high school. So I know I'm talking to a lot of my friends with kids, and everybody's stressed because it's like, are we going back into the office? Are we not going back into the office? Is our democracy going to fall apart, or are we going to be okay? And so I think there's still a lot of like shell shock right now. And everybody's trying to figure out how to be, because this new normal that we were starting to adjust to shifted. And then now we have the Delta variant, and everybody's like, and so I'm seeing a lot of people who are almost like frozen in place. Trying to wait for some sort of guidance on what to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing. So on the Lincoln Project podcast gang, a few weeks ago, I had a woman named Dr. Charity Dean on. She was featured in Michael Lewis's new book called Premonition, about how the United States and various health agencies responded to COVID in 2020. And we talked a lot about the Delta variant, and the thing that she talked about in 2020 is the same thing we're experiencing now with the Delta piece, which is once we, quote, break containment, everything else is just trying to mitigate for that. And so last year, no one believed it, or we were too slow on the stick, or whatever it was, or we reopened too quickly. We didn't do the things we needed to do in time, and therefore we had, public health consequences, we had economic consequences. And now we have, 45% of people who just refuse to get vaccinated. And I was thinking about this. I was talking to some friends last night, in a county like Los Angeles County, California, there are like 11 million people there, right? Yeah. In a fairly, it's a gigantic county, right? It's bigger than some states, both geographically and certainly by population. But if 40% of those people aren't vaccinated, that's 4 million people in pretty close proximity to a whole heck of a lot of people who are coming and going, getting on planes, getting in cars, driving all over creation. So, these things have a real chance to move and spread quickly. And as we've seen, this thing is very contagious. It's going to tear through some populations. And, now we even see some Republicans that are starting to, say, please go get vaccinated. And we'll take a couple of questions on that. But talk to me about school, because I know for our schools where I live, it sounds like there will be, at least for a few schools, the kids will have to wear masks during the day. It doesn't sound like they'll be locked in their classrooms like they were here in Utah last year. But she also understand, like in Utah, like our kids were in school all year, right? Which I think for you and for a lot of other people, that wasn't the case.
Wow. Okay. So you guys are going to be way far ahead. Your children are going to be way smarter, because any parent
solely thanks to their mother. So.
I was gonna say, it's just everybody in Utah who had access to, continuous in-person education. And I think that's what everybody was looking forward to here in LA. And I can tell you, like, this is the crazy thing about LA. So many people were vaccinated, but again, the 40% that weren't, when they took away the mask mandate, it was supposed to be the honor system. And I was in the grocery store and I was like, nobody has their mask on. And I know at least 40% of these people aren't actually vaccinated. So the whole honor system is really what I think led to a lot of the spread here. And so with back to school, LA Unified does not require the teachers to be vaccinated, right? There's no vaccine mandate. And so, the kids are going to have to be masked, and it's going to be a really interesting back to school. It's stressful for everybody. But I think a part of it is also trying to balance am I working from home? Am I working? Am I going into the office? A lot of the offices were on the verge of opening up here,
Right.
and now they're not. And this is a production town. So you have a lot of productions that are now being threatened as well because of outbreaks. So, and I think at the end of the day, it's a trust issue. We're having a lot of hard time trusting people in America right now. And so it really pissed me off to see Sarah. I get pissed off. It's true, right? I get pissed. I get angry. But Sarah Huckabee Sanders came out and is now, saying, hey, we're not going to tell you to get the vaccine, but this is why I got vaccinated. And it's like, you could have said that months ago and saved lives. And so I think it's like this issue of like, a lot of people are like, who do I believe? Who do I trust? And I feel like people aren't going to forget the fact that people have died now because people have lied. Like, no one's going to forget that.
No, and certainly we're not going to let them. Anyway, I think it's also interesting that the NFL this week basically said if your team can't play, excuse me, in a given week because of a COVID outbreak, you forfeit the game. We're not going to replay it. We're not going to reschedule it. And in college football, the Southeastern Conference, which is the conference for the most part in college football, said the same thing, which is if there's a COVID outbreak on your team and you can't play, you forfeit that. If it's a non-conference game, whatever, and if it's a conference game. And most of the states in the Southeast Conference, Florida, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, these are a lot of places that don't have a lot of, their vaccination rates are rather low. Somebody said over the weekend, if Nick Saban, the head coach of the Alabama football team, told the people of Alabama, get vaccinated or we're not going to play, 90% of this place would be vaccinated, in 3 days.
Because they trust him. Yeah, they trust football.
They trust him and they love him, right? And they don't want to. They don't want to see the Crimson Tide, forfeit a game against Vanderbilt because there was an outbreak on their team. So
it's a lot of enough's enough. I think people are just fed up. That's you asked me about how the everyman feels. I think people are also fed up. It's like we want to go back to living our normal lives, and people are like screwing it up for everybody else, and we're pissed. So.
Yeah, and before we get to questions, that's the last part too. I've talked to several friends who the theme has been going back to the office was sort of a Labor Day. That was going to be the benchmark, and now folks are getting emails. At least 2 or 3 people I've talked to that said, coming back to the office is on hold indefinitely. We'll get back to you. So, all right. Well, let's take our first question here. Thanks, Emily. It says, Alisia Marie says, question regarding the Insurrection Committee. What is this committee's power and capability in removing those senators found to have committed insurgent acts? Okay, good question. So the Select Committee on January 6th was established by Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She has appointed the Democrats. As we know, Kevin McCarthy appointed 5 Republicans, 3 of whom were seditionists. They voted against certification in January. Pelosi struck 2 of those as her right as the Speaker, and McCarthy just took his ball and went home, pulled all his guys. Liz Cheney and now Adam Kinzinger, 2 Republicans who voted for impeachment of the president, are now serving. So it is a bipartisan committee. This committee will have subpoena power. It will have the ability to, at least attempt to compel people to testify. The witnesses will be under oath. And if they lie, then they will have been, they are liable to, having perjured themselves before the Congress. And so, I think tomorrow we're going to see several police officers who were there on January 6th will get up and testify. And then I think you're going to see, whether or not it's a lot of people related to the Republican sort of broader political operation. You're going to see members of Congress, in the House and members of the Senate. This committee in and of itself cannot take any action against a United States senator, but it certainly could pull out things about what that United States senator did that maybe the Department of Justice could take action on. But I think we're a long way from there. All right, Maya, here we go. Laura Beverage on Facebook. Speaking of Hannity, how much influence do you think he will have on getting these unvaccinated Trumpers to finally get their shots? Ingram and Blank Carlson are still beating the quote, don't vax drum. So, I think, Maya, this was really interesting. And I think this is something that we've talked about. You really have to see the Republicans now as not a party but as a sort of authoritarian movement, and it's got all the components of it, and it's really an ecosystem. And what you saw was that there was a lot of pressure on Fox News to get off the, anti-vax train. That probably came from a lot of their legal people who said, like, we don't want to get some class action suit against us, right? We don't want to get sued for this stuff.
Yeah.
Hannity last week went on and said, like, talk to your doctor, but these vaccines work and you should get it done. The next day, he goes on his radio show, I assume after being just pilloried by his viewers and his listeners, goes on his radio show, blasts the vaccine stuff. The next night, goes on his show and says, I never told you to get vaccinated. I never said get vaccinated. And so what I think you're seeing here, guys, is this weird, and you see this now. I mean, no activist or real conservative Republican likes Mitch McConnell. So the fact that he said something like doesn't matter to them. But Ron DeSantis and a lot of these other people, what you're seeing is they're now being seen as like, well, now are you part of the deep state now? Are you the one who's trying to get the Bill Gates, microchip put in me? And so, guys, this isn't just like there's a whole sort of psychosis that goes along with this. It's not just like don't get vaccinated. It's now somebody who told me not to get vaccinated is telling me I should get vaccinated. So have they been co-opted?
Right. And that's
insanity.
It is insanity. And, I've talked about this before comedy is very similar to being a con man, right? Like we have to create a reality. We have to create a premise. And in order to be able to create a premise, you have to stick to a certain truth. And what they've done right now at Fox News is they had a truth that they were running with that they didn't realize was going to get people killed. I think they waded into those waters hoping that this would be the thing that would stick it to, Biden, and he wouldn't be able to get hit his vaccination rates. And instead what happened is people started dying, the variant happened, and so they're backtracking. But what happens when you backtrack like that is your audience goes, what am I to believe? And these are the trust issues that I was talking about earlier. And so what we're seeing right now is mass confusion. And as they're going to try to figure out what line they want to say next. And they know this is a very critical time. And I think this is perfect for us because this is where we get to go for the jugular and take them down. So.
Well, no, and Maya, you also make a good point, which is, authoritarian movements must live in the present. They can't live in the past because oftentimes it doesn't speak well of them. And they can't look to the future because they will never make a promise for the greater good that they'd have no intention of keeping. And I think I would also say this is that what you saw last week was not a desire by Sean Hannity or Ron DeSantis or any of these people to actually get people to take the vaccine. Let's be clear, they're all vaccinated, right? Like they've all gotten the shots. But rather they saw that they had a pending political issue that they had to contend with. So they said the things they thought they needed to say at that moment, right? Now they had a bigger political issue, which is the people that really believed them, as you said, were like, wait a second. And so now you had this weird, like, cognitive dissonance within an unreality. Like, I don't know, maybe the Germans have a word for it, but we don't. That's starting to sort of twist and turn. And I think you're absolutely right. This is the kind of stuff that we can and should take advantage of. All right. Yum Pitts on Twitter says, there's a lot of talk about Trump running for Speaker of the House. Is this possible and how? Well, first and foremost, Republicans would have to take the House next year in next year's midterm elections. They would have to have a majority. And then a majority of members of Congress would have to vote to make him Speaker. There's one of these weird things in the Constitution, like what it leaves out. When it talks about the Speaker of the House, it only talks about the method and manner of their election. It does not say that this person must be a member of Congress. Just like the Constitution leaves open whether or not a member of the Supreme Court even has to be a judge or a lawyer. And so, if let's say the Republicans had 240 votes, could they elect Donald Trump the Speaker of the House? I suppose they could. I put nothing past the unreality that we've lived in the last 12 to 18 months. But yeah, it's possible. It'd be interesting to see how many, Republicans then broke ranks to vote with Democrats, but I don't count on that. I mean, we're down to now 2 Republican members of the House that seem to have any backbone left. So stranger things have not happened. So
Reed, when I lived in Argentina, this reminds me of like how in Argentina, like you could be the president and then people want to cling to power so much that like I think Menem ended up being a senator, then going to prison, and Kirchner, after she was president, she went back to being a senator. And so
remember, wasn't Kirchner's husband president first and then she was president?
Exactly. Yeah. Right. There's this clinging to power and this circular. And so that again, like speaks to this kind of leaning to this kind of authoritarian situation where people just want to maintain power as opposed to actually govern, because it's not like Trump wants to be the Speaker of the House because he wants to make America a better place.
No, that's right. And I mean, that's the other part too, guys, is that I think we've seen and I think that this hasn't really been talked a lot about and it hasn't been explored a lot, but I think the one thing that Republicans, especially Republicans like governors and members of the legislature, I think are underestimating is that they like have jobs that impact people's lives on a daily basis, just like a mayor does or a county commissioner does. And so I think that, there's a lot of pent up probably frustration on, for members of both parties in these positions that have real impact on people's lives that I don't think has really come to the fore yet. All right, let's see. Vince says, will the 1-6 committee have the guts to enforce subpoenas on members of Congress who are called in to testify? I would assume so. They can defy the subpoena. I think they're in contempt of Congress. I'm not enough of a either congressional scholar or constitutional scholar to understand what the implications of that are. But we should assume that'll be the case because, especially for anybody who was, leading a quote unquote tour on January 5th, they're not likely to want to get up there. And let's be clear, they don't care for the rules anyway, unless they can somehow hide behind them. I will be interested to see if one of them does, or if some of them do get called to testify and actually show up, if any of them will actually hide behind the Fifth Amendment, which is, obviously you don't have to incriminate yourself in a court of law or an open proceeding, which would be, the height of irony that they don't like the Constitution, tried to overturn it, but then when they needed it, they tried to hide behind it. So,
yeah. And as the every person here, let me tell you, this is frustrating because we watch and we see that they're not being held accountable and that they can hide behind these things. And I think that's what's so frustrating on possibly both sides, but definitely from a Democratic perspective, it's like, okay, so exactly how then are people held accountable? And so watching it over and over again and watching it play out, especially because we did all see what happened on January 6th, like everybody saw it and it's had a huge effect on our stability and our mood. And so for the everyday perspective, it's like, how do I then tell my kids? Like, that's, I think what a lot of people are asking, how do we model good behavior if at the highest level in our country, we're not seeing accountability?
Right.
Like, how do we do that?
Well, and also, I mean, it's not only the accountability piece, is that the boundaries of what we consider normal civil society are all out of whack. And I think that, Trump certainly gave license to a lot of people. I think especially a lot of American white guys license to be the assholes they've always been in their heads, but understood that it wasn't polite or advantageous to them to say out loud. A lot of them say this stuff, the things that we would never assume you could say out loud now, because there's no sanction for it, right? There's no public opprobrium, and there's no sense of guilt or shame in these people's, inner monologues anymore. And so, I think that's a part of it too, which is, well, how do you explain to your kids what's okay and what's not when, they hear about all this stuff all day?
Yeah. And it's just one more thing on this is it feels like now being canceled is like a badge of honor. Like, it's almost like how rappers have to get shot to have that street cred. It's like now I feel like on the right, there's like people who are just saying the most outrageous things because Trump enabled it, but also because that rallies up their base. And it's like, they're trying to cancel me, which they're actually not being canceled at all. They're just, being held to account. So
yeah, well, I mean, it's like I have no way to communicate my message except for Twitter, Facebook, my own YouTube page, Fox News, Newsmax, the book I'm writing, my radio show, and my podcast. Right? Like, no one can find me. I'm like Ted Kaczynski out in the woods. Like, no, I'm not. I'm disconnected from reality. All right. Michael Gerhardt asked, there is a question. Could a class action suit against Fox, OAN, and Newsmax be brought for false information that leads to the deaths of thousands? I am not an attorney. Do not take legal or financial advice from me, but it would not surprise me if someone does that. And I think that what Fox in particular, I think is probably concerned about, and I think this is why you tried to see, them get their talent back in line last week, is that someone could sue them, and then there would be discovery. And what if that went forward? What would that discovery say? What would those emails say? What would those, the minutes of whatever production meetings they might have say? And Fox is not immune to this kind of stuff. They have paid out, millions and millions of dollars worth of settlements in the last few years, whether or not it was for, rampant sexual harassment and sexual misconduct in their ranks, or if it was the family of Seth Rich. Who they beat this conspiracy drum and put his poor parents and family through hell for the better part of a couple of years, and in something that was just nothing but a conspiracy. So I think it'd be interesting. I'm sure there's an attorney out there who would be happy to do it. As we talked about, there's some attorneys love the limelight as much as anybody. So it'd be interesting to see if that happens. And you could probably find, I don't know what makes up a class, quote unquote, but wouldn't surprise me. All right, let's see. Emily, if we've got more questions, we'll take them. Can Trump be called to testify? That's a good question. I don't know. I suppose he could be, but I think it would be nearly impossible to compel a former president to do anything he doesn't want to do. So, I mean, testify. Why do you need him to testify? He goes out and says this shit all day long. He said it in Phoenix over the weekend. I mean, he's not, guys, this is what we always said about Trump was he was the most transparent president we ever had. Anything that was going through his head, as kooky as it was, we knew about. He said it himself. He said it on Twitter. He said it to Hannity. He said it to one of his aides who then immediately leaked it. He said it to a reporter directly. And so, the things that, he's liable for, he's out there on the record. So, I'm not sure how necessary it is. I think the question is, was there any coordination or was there any true conspiracy between people who knew that there was this group of people coming, to Washington? And remember, guys, these were not the folks who came to Washington, for January 6th. These were not people who were out of work coal miners, right? These were not folks who had been displaced by a 21st century technology economy. Most of these people were middle class, upper middle class, well-to-do. Some of them came on a private jet. Yeah. A lot of them wore $10,000 or $15,000 worth of tactical gear. As you go through it, a lot of them were professionals, right? So this was not like the white working class rising up. This was very much a revolt from sort of the upper middle class white people, which is a whole thing that we could discuss in and of itself. All right, Maya, has LP thought about organizing us grassroots style in person? I'm in Jim Banks's district in District 3 in Indiana. I think we will. In fact, that's part of the things that we're working on now, guys, is getting out on the road a little bit. As Maya noted, we'll see, how possible that is, but I think, we will be able to get out on the road. We had tens of thousands of volunteers who were enormously helpful to our efforts in states across the country last year. We're currently in the process of starting to, build out this, pro-democracy coalition that is going to be, Republicans, independents, Democrats, people, whether you believe it or not, gang, like Liz Cheney is on the side of the angels in this particular moment in time. You may disagree with everything she likes policy-wise. You may disagree with her father on Iraq and all sorts of things. But in the context of this pro-democracy fight, Liz Cheney's an ally. Adam Kinzinger's an ally. If there's a Republican who stood up for the Constitution and said no more, they are allies. And so I think that's a really important thing. And so, yeah, I think we will get in the grassroots thing. That's one of the great things about having like a Joe Trippi and his team on board now, is that they are so good at that grassroots stuff that it really brings a piece of expertise strategically and tactically that we didn't have before. So I think there'll be far more to say about that as we go forward. But guys, it's going to take all of us. Maya and I were talking about this right before we went on. If a few weeks back, Rick and I were standing in a backyard in California, and the person who spoke for us was the executive director of the local county party, the local Democratic Party. And Rick and I were standing there laughing. We said, could you believe, like 3 years ago, could you imagine us, like, that would be the person we'd follow to speak? Like, we could not have believed it, but, strange bedfellows and all that.
Well, and I think the more that we connect with each other, we do realize, and I want to give a shout out to the podcast real quick, because when you had Beto on, you guys talked about this, and he shared the story about being at an outdoor sort of town hall, and somebody asked about why voter ID is why is that such a big problem, and a neighbor chimed in and talked about her multiple sclerosis and how it was difficult for her to register, and that story alone helped change minds, right? With the people who were there. And I think a big part of grassroots organizing that I love is that community conversation. Like, when we actually engage with each other in conversation and learn how to listen to each other. So it's not necessarily about trying to convince each other of something, but actually trying to listen and hear. What we start to hear is that sane people have sane solutions. And that to me is why it's so important that we learn to work together in that center where there is that commonality of, like, we want to have a sane life. That's all I want.
And let's be clear, guys, like 70% of the country, maybe 75% of the country lives somewhere in that middle that Maya just described. All right. Maya here. Vicky J says, is it good strategy to address the GOPs on Twitter to post their, quote, crimes and expose them in comments? I think it's a broader thing other than Twitter, which is, guys, we want to make sure that the craziest of the crazy is exposed to as many people as possible. We want to push, look, whether or not Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy want to believe it, the leaders of the Republican Party are people like Donald Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, and Jim Jordan, right? Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz. Those are the people who run the party. Those are the people who listen, they have the energy, both at an activist and voter level. They have the energy at a small dollar fundraising level. They don't, and here's the other part too, they don't need anybody else to do the things they do. And so when we see last week a bunch of, otherwise, quasi, normal, or I guess wanting to be seen as normal Republicans talking about getting vaccinated, you had Marjorie Taylor Greene out there saying, I'm not going to tell you whether or not I got vaccinated because it's my HIPAA oath, which, like, that's the argument they want about HIPAA, which I don't even know what that means, but it means, I guess, you can't talk, a doctor can't share your private information, but that's the fight they want, guys. They don't want to talk about whether or not they got vaccinated. They want to throw the bright, shiny object so everybody argues about, well, it's not about that, you're just lying, as opposed to what they did. All right, Maya, before we go, Emily, are we going to play that video? Let's go ahead and play the video, guys, and then we will get out of here. It's called Rematch. And
oh, I like this one. I've seen it. It's good.
And we're saying just 1 sec. So, Maya, what else do you see out there before we?
Well, I was going to say, one of the questions that did come up a lot is, Trump's out here with the same rhetoric that he was before, the same rhetoric that led to January 6th. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that the power of words that he had has not changed. And if anything, with his base has escalated, and he is continuing to go from rally to turning point to CPAC with this same level of anger, and it will lead to more violence. And so I think that's why it's so important that with the 1/6 Commission starting this week, that we start to really hold him to account for that, which is why I'm so excited about this rematch. Right. I think.
All right, B, let her rip.
The Lincoln Project was formed. They are doing tougher ads against Trump than any Democratic group.
They've decided to take the strategic and ad-making firepower they've trained for years on Democrats and turn it against their own.
And in almost every ad, they talk about how he's a loser, how he's weak.
Unyielding, unrelenting ass-kicking of Donald Trump and his children and his campaign advisors.
The Lincoln group, these never Trump Republicans, the Democrats could learn a lot from them. They're mean. They fight hard, and we don't fight like that.
There is never a day where we're like, we should take it easy on Trump today.
Are you sure you want to do this again, Donald? If you think we hit you hard the first time.
So they should not call it the Lincoln Project. They should call it the Losers Project.
Just remember.
I don't remember.
We're still here, and the only loser is you.
All right. Well, always a fun one. So Maya, do you know, so Maya's the host of We're Speaking Wednesday nights at 8 Eastern. Before we get out of here, Maya, who do you guys have this week?
Oh, this week is exciting. We're talking about funding the fascists. We have, we're looking at a couple of scholars that we're bringing, Lisa and I, and we're going to be talking about funding the fascists, because you cannot have politicians out there doing this work if you don't have the companies that are funding them. So we're going to be covering that.
Well, and guys, that's right. And on the podcast, I think that will drop today will be Judd Legum, who is the author of Popular Information, who has been hugely helpful in exposing a lot of those same companies that Maya's talking about and who they're, who they're funding and why. I think you'll be seeing some really exciting ads coming from us on the Republican donor front this week as well. So, guys, I know we ran over a little bit, but I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to B. Thank you to Emily. Thanks to everybody watching, and we will see you Friday. Thanks, guys.
Bye.